All right, I am going to introduce our moderator here for this evening. Peter Bennett has been on faculty here at the Los Angeles Center for Photography for many years, dating back to the days on Venice Beach. Great individual, terrific instructor. Just to read some of his credits, he's been a successful travel and environmental photographer for over 25 years. In 2015, he formed Citizen of the Planet, LLC, which is devoted exclusively to the distribution of his stories and work that focus on environmental subjects such as fracking, drought, green construction, alternative energies, urban farming, and water and air quality issues. Peter's books include New York City, a photographic portrait, Our San Diego, Only in Los Angeles, and the Los Angeles River book, which just recently came out. I have a copy of this book, amazing book. Highly encourage you to get over to Peter's website. If you haven't had a copy of this, order it up. It's an amazing book on the LA River. Okay, enough of my shenanigans. I am going to give the floor over to Peter. Peter, take it away.
Thanks so much, Brandon, and thank you, Jason. Appreciate the kind words, and welcome everyone to another edition of Inside Photography series here. It's great to see everyone. Tonight's presenter, as you know, is David H. Wells. And David is a New England-based visual storyteller. He is a filmmaker and photographer who divides his time between Providence, Rhode Island, and Bangalore, Maine, India.
India.
Little geographically confused there. David has worked with numerous corporate and editorial clients, but also finds time for personal and grant-funded projects in his home area of Rhode Island and India. And he's worked on assignment for such magazines as Fortune, Life, National Geographic, Newsweek, the Sunday New York Times, and Time, among others. One editor described David as a specialist in intercultural communication and visual narratives that excel in their creative mastery of light, shadow and sound, stills and video. And his project on the pesticide poisoning of California farm workers was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize by the Philadelphia Inquirer. He teaches workshops around the globe in Italy and Morocco, as well as the main media workshops in the International Center of Photography in New York. And he was featured in Photo District News as one of the 13 best workshop instructors. And if you know how many workshops there are out there, that is quite an honor. So as Brandon mentioned, David is going to be teaching a workshop here at LACP, which David will tell you a little bit more about. He's also received many numerous awards for his still work and his films. And if you go to a website, you can see the list. There are way too many to talk about here. You know, when I've looked at David's work, not only do I see great storytelling, but he does it in such an engaging, creative, and artistic way, a really unique combination. I really enjoyed looking at his work, and I know you will too. David, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you also, Brandon, Jason, and thanks for having me back at LACP. You said, Brandon, that my class ideally will be in person. I really am excited about that idea because I know we'll be outdoors when we're photographing and we're following all the protocols, but just that face-to-face thing, there's a lot that we can do tonight, and I hope Peter and I have a good conversation. But in the end, I do think that in-person process is really, really key. So I just wanted to sort of thank you and mention that. So this is not sort of one of my usual talks. Most of the time I'm talking about a topic or travel photography or commercial photography. This, based on a conversation that Peter and I had before the talk, is really more about my journey. And I remember when I was a young photographer, I was told this a lot. And I must say, when I was young, I hated this because I just wanted to know where the destination was. I wasn't terribly interested in what was going to happen along the way. And for those of you who are snickering to yourself, of course, the point is that the journey is what matters. It's not the destination. So I'm going to take you through my journey. I am going to, I hope at the end, or maybe with some prodding from Peter or prodding with questions from you, bring it back to what I aspire to do in the in-person class, because I do think that seeing like a camera is very different than our eye sees. And we know that the difference between your eye and your brain see and the way the camera sees is quite different. And then the other thing that's really important as a photographer, and I think I've gotten pretty good at over the years, is editing, selecting the best images, the worst images, figuring out which ones are going to tell the story. That's a really key part of photography as well. So we're going to go back to the beginning. We were going to go back to the beginning. There we go. We're going to go back to the beginning. And in case you haven't figured out, that's me on the right with a nice bow tie to my brother, my older sister. I grew up in Downey, for those of you who know your LA geography well. So I actually am technically a Southern California, a child of Southern California, though I got there at age 6, but for all intents and purposes, especially in terms of the photography you're going to see here tonight, I was very heavily shaped by growing up in California. Had a really excellent high school photography teacher who was smart enough to teach me everything he knew, and then he just said, go and take pictures. And so because I didn't have a car, I used to get on the buses in Downey and take what you may remember, Southern California Rapid Transit District, I think it was called, the old buses, pre-subways and what they have out there now. And I was just going out and doing, I guess you'd call it street photography now, but for me, it was just really getting out of Downey and photographing everything that I could find. And I recently, because of COVID, had the opportunity to go through basically everything that I'd ever done, because all of the stock photo agencies I used to work with have all gone out of business. And so they kept sending me all my slides back, and I was piling up this really extraordinarily large closet full of slides. And then COVID came along, and one of the things is I went through all of them and I found, I think this may be the first color slide that I ever shot, for example. And this is a pretty recent discovery. I'm not saying it's a brilliant picture, but for me, it's a reminder of that very early part in my photography where I was trying to learn to see like a camera and eventually to learn how to edit and select the best pictures. And so I just photographed, like I think a lot of the things that a lot of starting photographers do, people you meet. And I was taken over and over, and I think this is a function of a childhood in Southern California. I was taken by the quality of light out there. And it's one of the few things that I miss living on the East Coast is I miss the magic of the light there. I mean, there are beautiful days in Rhode Island. You know, New England has famous autumn weather, and the light is beautiful. But I think I now, especially being away from it for so long, really kind of understand, besides the economics, what drew the film industry out there and how my way of looking at the world, which you'll see as we go on with the slides, how that was shaped by the light of growing up in California. I went to college actually in Southern California. You'll notice I have a chin at this point in time and mine's a different color. I studied the history of photography in college and why that's important. And it was so interesting to hear Brandon talking about a class on the history of street photography. For me, the history of photography, which I studied in Claremont, moved photography from this commercial thing that my high school photography teacher, who was a great guy, but he had a pretty conventional definition of commercial photography. And when I studied the history of photography, I discovered this universe of other possibilities, which has been, and to this day, really drives what I do as a photographer and a visual storyteller. So along the way, I tried to mimic the styles of different photographers and experiment with different photographers. And so this week I was imitating the photographer Dwayne Michaels, who did a lot of self-portraits and sequences. And it's rudimentary stuff, but I was moving from this very narrow definition of photography to this really, really expansive definition of photography. And for me as a visual learner, because I think if we're in this group tonight, you're a visual learner. The text-based learners are down the hall in a different meeting, but the visual learners are here. The only way that I could figure out my way to understand something like photography as fine art rather than just photography as commerce was just to do it. And then I really started to get sort of play with it, the two different sides of photography that I think really drive my work till this day, which is the formal, which is what you see in this image, and the informational, which is what you see in this image. And they are the same picture. This is a close-up, obviously. a wide angle shot. We won't talk about the idiot who drove their Jaguar under a school bus in Rockefeller Center in 1978, but we'll let that slide. And because I was in Southern California, and if you know your history, this guy ended up being a big part of my early career. His campaign obviously was based in Los Angeles. He was out there during the election of 1980. And I did a lot of work around photojournalism and a lot of work around campaign photography. But I must say, I really didn't think I knew anything. And this is the photo that really proves that I didn't know anything, except I knew really specifically how to expose color slides correctly. This is important, this photo, for me for two reasons. One, it was the first published photo I ever had. It is of apparently in the fashion page of the New York Times in 1980, because it's the first time a president in the United States has been seen wearing blue jeans, they tell me. It also actually has that violation of Composition Rule 101, which is what you're thinking. He actually has a helicopter blade, a rotor, growing straight out of his head, dead smack in the middle. And I mention that because as I was looking through all this stuff, I really got to understand that I was able to get to these places and get these exposures right, but I didn't know a whole lot. So I took a step backwards and I ended up working in Southgate for a small newspaper. This was done for the small newspaper. We did a ton of local traffic accident kind of stuff, weather-related features. And I would never, especially in the current economy, because it was interesting to hear Peter talk about the list of publications which I work for, and I had a great time doing magazine work, but as you know, that's a market that's really changed for the worse now. But for me, working for newspapers for a few years was the best way to get that skill of seeing like a camera, and then having editors teach me the hard way how to edit. People doing exceptionally dumb things with pickup trucks and alcohol. And so these are things that are very early in my career, but they're the things that I did to learn how to make a living as a photojournalist, which I did until relatively recently, until that kind of work really receded from the making a viable living. But they also taught me things like how to tell a story, how to use light and shadow. And then I started doing stories. This was the first serious story that I remember in my evolution. It's a story on a homeless family living in a school bus in Fort Worth, Texas. I got to photograph this guy for the LA Times. This was a long time ago, if you remember him. And there are many young people you show this to, and they don't know what he used to do before what he does now. It's been so long. This is the original version, my preferred version. And then along the way, I did a whole bunch of other things. I did a ton of work for magazines. I was very fortunate, more by dumb luck than bringing attention, to be working on a different project in Israel in 1991 during the first Gulf War. And I always find it really bizarre that we number them, that idea of having a first one and a second one, but that's another conversation to put to the side for the moment. And along the way, I took those same skills that I developed as a newspaper photographer and started working for magazines. And for many years, that's what I did. I had an expertise at exposing color slides really well and working very sort of economically and basically on my own in the third world. And so I used to get sent a lot of places. That was India. That was India in the north. This is India in the south. And the thing that I developed a real passion for and continue to do to this day, and I'll show you one short film at the end of the presentation, but I've now migrated into films, but this was one of the early picture stories that I did. This is on an Orthodox Jewish yeshiva, a school for Jewish high school students in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And one of the things that I was learning was to play to my strengths and to figure out when I was sort of out of my depth. And this is a classical one because I actually am Jewish, and I very briefly studied in an Orthodox Jewish yeshiva, and I found I was very bad at following rules. but it gave me enough of a skill set and enough of a language and culture to understand and work with these young men, because it is a very male world, to do the first of a number of different stories that I did for the Philadelphia Inquirer Sunday magazine. Because back in the day, Sunday magazines were really the best place to do photo stories. The previous were being more informational, this one being a little more atmospheric, and I'm always toggling back and forth in both my films now and in the photo stories I used to do, in that balance between how much information do you convey and how much atmosphere and how much sort of feeling of a place do you get. Because if you have too much atmosphere and feeling and light, it's kind of eye candy. If you have pure information, it's a little too documentary, and I'm always toggling between the two. Another one of the stories I did for the Philadelphia Inquirer Sunday magazines on squatters living in abandoned homes, which was a very big problem in the Philadelphia in the 80s and 90s. And so, and then along the way, as I said, I started developing this expertise. This is from Cuba, where I did some teaching for the main media workshops. And I developed this expertise in traveling and making color slides pretty much anywhere that somebody would send me. And now we call it a low footprint. China, because of course now with everything digital and everyone having cameras, it's a completely different universe. But at this point in time, magazines were just really getting deeply involved in color, so they needed to have color slides made from all these places, and that was an expertise that I developed. And this was a payphone in China, and I've been reading some stuff because of what's going on in the world right now about China, and it's so interesting because this was done in 86, 87, and of course in the early 90s is when the modernization that we know in China started. And this is a brief selection from the story that Peter alluded to. This was on the pesticide poisoning of farm workers in the Central Valley of California. And the story, and it's not, the presentation is not about the story, so I don't want to go too much in there. But I'm always struggling, as I said before, with the balance of giving you a sense of what it feels like, for example, to be sprayed by a crop duster here, and then what the story is in terms of these families who were affected by this spraying. And this little boy is named Felipe Franco. And this is a woman driving home from the grave of her granddaughter that she visited. The granddaughter and Felipe Franco were both most likely harmed by the pesticides in the areas where they were living when they were being cared by their mothers. And again, this is all in the Central Valley. And he is developmentally perfectly normal. I have not been in touch with him in a few years, but he'd be in his mid-50s now, and there's no reason to think he's not around and still challenged. And this is an enormously tightly edited selection. I think I showed you 6 pictures from a project that took almost a year. And I mention that because, again, in the class, and I think in photography in general, one of the real skills is learning how to select which few images tell the story versus which many can almost reduce the quality of the story that you're trying to tell. Another big project that I did along the way was on the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians. Living in Israel at the time to do this project ended up with my stint working for Life magazine during the Gulf War. And so I was trying to show all sorts of interactions between Israelis and Palestinians. Conflict here, more of that here. And then coexistence here. And then in school programs where they explicitly try to cooperate. And that idea of the Israeli-Palestinian relationship being both conflict, coexistence, and cooperation. I did this work 90, 91, 92. I did it on a grant from the MacArthur Foundation. You've heard of the MacArthur Foundation. They give out their genius grants. I did not get a genius grant. I got what I think of as a very intelligent grant. But the idea that they understood that photographing all those aspects for me was transformative, both in terms of simply having the money to do the work and to continue the sort of motion forward, telling stories through pictures. And I'm now in Rhode Island. We have been here, boy, we've been here 24 years. And one of the most common blue collar jobs in this part of New England is shell fishing or quahogging. And so this is from a project I did on shell fishermen, virtually all of whom have dogs. It's a requirement. When you sign the contract for your boat, you have to get a dog. I'm being a little sarcastic, but they do have their dogs. It's a solo profession mostly, so they tend to have the dogs partly for comfort and partly for safety. And then again, I think I mentioned, but just to be clear, my wife is from India. So along the way, I ended up doing a ton of work in India, some for publications, some on 2 different Fulbright fellowships. And when people ask me, did I set that up? And my response is always, I couldn't have set it up because I would not have put 4 people on there. I would have put 3, but I just was not smart enough to put number 4. The guy in the back, I have no idea what he's doing there. So no, this is not a posed photograph. I'm mostly interested, and this is just me because there is extraordinary photography done these days that is about the emotional experience, the intellectual experience, or the storytelling experience through the brain and the lens and the eye of the artist. And I must say, especially when I was doing art photography in college, I tried that. That is not my forte. My forte is to photograph something derived from whatever's in front of me. And that's what I said earlier about playing to my strengths and really, really getting away from what I'm not good at. So here's a little bit of stuff just about daily life in India. And it is a lot of street photography. And if you're thinking this looks like that picture I showed, the 3rd or 4th picture of the man with the hat, in some ways, there's only 4 or 5 things that I do really well. And there's a lot of things that I stay away from. I stay away from fashion. I actually got an award from my peers once for being one of the worst sports photographers as a newspaper photographer because it just wasn't something I cared about. I do a lot with light and place because that is still what captures my eye. It's that most basic, photo 1 assignment that I had in high school. And my coppinger, my teacher, gave me. He said, go out and photograph light and shadows. And there are days I think I'm still doing that exact same assignment. And then the other thing, to go back to that thing about the balance between the formal pictures and the informational pictures, I'm not smart enough to put a Ganesha in next to a satellite dish, but I am smart enough to walk around and find it. We normally go to India a couple times a year. I have been there actually twice on Fulbright fellowships. I lived there for a total of 1.5 years on your tax dollars. It was very kind of you. I do thank you very much for sending me there. And it's a great place for photography. People love to be photographed. This is so typical. This is the explosion in housing and building bigger houses in a country where a lot of people still don't have decent housing, and all sorts of change that you can see right out in public going on in front of your cameras, in front of your eyes. And then the other thing which I love about photographing in India, so much of life is lived outside and into the night and twilight, partly because of the warm weather, partly because of the lack of private space. But you get things like this on the beach in Chennai where they're grilling corn on charcoal. An altar boy at an Indian Christian church. more stuff from India, salt harvesting. And so I kept going back and forth, and as the publication world was kind of coming out from underneath me, I was experimenting still more with this idea of trying to make some kind of storytelling imagery collections, in this case, diptychs and triptychs, using the work from India. And I had a lot of fun. It was shown some, I don't think it was, I'm not sure. I think it's just because I don't do that kind of work enough that I was able to really bring it forward. But one of the things that I have learned over the years, and the long mining of the slide archive that I mentioned earlier that I did just in the last couple of years because of COVID, was that I learned over looking back on a lot of this stuff, that I'm perfectly comfortable with experimenting with something like this, and also perfectly comfortable with kind of what's the word, cutting my losses, like saying this is an interesting idea, it didn't work, so let's move on and not try too hard. Because the idea was that I was trying, of course, to create kind of a visual story between the multiple images. And the film that I show you at the end, I think is going to be doing a better job of that than these do. And I showed that partly because it was part of my progress, and partly because I don't think people show their less than successful work nearly enough. I mean, at some point in time, Brandon, we should talk about my favorite class. I've always wanted to teach a class on all the failed projects I've done, because I actually think that if you could get the accomplished photographers out there, all of us to line up and talk about the disasters we had, I think a lot of people would feel much more reassured to know the things that they did along the way, that I did along the way that didn't work, are much more similar to the things that everybody does along the way that doesn't work. I don't imagine you can fill that class, but I do think it would be a lot of fun to try. Because this is, though it was a fun experiment, I don't think it worked. This is a more recent project, and I like to think it did work. This was on foreclosed houses. I ended up working in 18 different states between 2009 and 2015. And this was the last serious photo story that I did. I showed you the Orthodox Jewish yeshiva. I showed you the squatters, the pesticide poisoning project. This is the last thing I did, and it was very unusual for me because there are no people. These are all the things that people are forced or were forced to leave behind, especially 2009 to 2014, 15, when they are being evicted. And I would get into these houses right after the foreclosure and right before they were cleaned up. And you have this strange window of things that are left behind. And it was all photographing still lives and interiors, which up until this point in time was relatively new to me. But it was another one of those things like, I'll try an experiment. I'll see if I can make it work. It ended up both being very successful, published, exhibited, posted, etc. a lot. And for me, it was a real departure. And again, I'm not smart enough to carry around an American flag and stuff in the towel rack of a house in Connecticut, but I am smart enough to get into that house and photograph it before the guys who clean them up come along in about 5 minutes and take that towel, the flag away. And the other thing that I do, and this goes back to that very first thing I was saying about the informational versus the atmospheric, is I do photo essays for different publications and clients. I did more than now on the light and atmosphere of places. And this is the first one I ever did, and I've done tons since. I won't show them all. But the idea is, for me, about I love photographing the way light plays in spaces. This is a train station, Philadelphia, back when you could smoke in a public place. And it's that, like I keep joking, it's the photo 101 assignment, go out and take pictures of light and shadow, but sort of ratchet it up. I am on the 5th floor catwalk looking straight down in Philadelphia's 30th Street station at the end of the day. And yeah, that is a really long shadow. And this is a really bad old days of film when you have to shoot a lot of pictures and then you get to look at it afterwards, but not the same day, obviously, because no instant feedback. And then you know whether you've got it or not. And then another one I did on the light and atmosphere in Philadelphia. And this is sort of my version of street photography. It's as much about the light and the atmosphere and the place as it is about the actual faces. I'm aware that a lot of people love street photography with people, and I get that. I'm much more interested in the sort of abstraction and dehumanizing or defacing, or taking away the individuality, because a lot of these cities to me tend to feel just like that, very anonymous and very non-specific. A similar one, this is on the Western Wall, the holiest shrine in the Jewish faith, which I did also during the time I was living in Israel. So there's not a linear order, but there is this series of things that I'm making and I'm discovering about myself. And I think that's, in some ways, the most important thing, is to figure out what it is you want to do and what it is keeps you moving forward, which is why I started with that quote about how I used to be frustrated by the idea of the journey, not the destination, but now I've really come to understand it. And so, for example, this is from a more recent photo, but this is from Morocco, where I teach a workshop every fall. Also in Morocco. Another place where the light reminded me a lot of the light of my childhood and my early in my career, which is, of course, Los Angeles. And it's an extraordinary country, both because of the culture, the history. It's a moderate Muslim culture, very heavy French influence, so the food is fabulous. This was supposed to be a silhouette of these camel guides, but this young guy pulled out a cell phone at the right time. So I think the expression is luck favors the prepared. And I continue photographing this kind of thing. This is Mexico, this is back in India, where it is still that play and shadow. It's not necessarily part of the story, but I'm still just intrigued at the way the light and shadow plays. This is a political rally where they're using iconography. And even if it doesn't necessarily have an end use like it used to when I did publication work, I am still completely captivated by that thing of just what it looks like. And I think also we as photographers want to say to the viewer, look at this, this is important. I want you to see this, or I want you to see that. And that's what I'm still most interested in. That's the part that really captures my attention the most. And this is actually a toy store in Sri Lanka. It's not nearly as weird as it looks, but a lot of people kind of get a taken back expression. And I love photographing at twilight, again, to this day, because of that very short window of time when the sky is magical. There's a street lamp overhead. A night market in Bangalore, India. Also in India. Mosquito netting in India as well. And now I'm going to show one very short 3-minute film. And the reason that I moved into films, initially I moved into film simply because that magazine world that I virtually lived off for the bulk of my paying career has migrated to the web and is mostly drawn to films, little short 3 to 5 minute films. And that's to some degree what I do now. The last couple of years I've been doing less and less because the price and the economics of that have been driven down. But I've really come to love making short films. And it's simply because with film, you take the elements that you saw about all the visuals and the storytelling and the human experience, and then you throw in time, movement, and sound. And those additions to me are a more complex way of storytelling. And of course, with the iPhones, because I do a shocking amount of filmmaking with this thing, believe it or not, or any kind of smartphone, you can do incredible, incredible things. So I'm going to show this one short film, and then I'm going to stop sharing my desktop, and then we'll start the real conversation. So let's see if this is going to work. There we go. right. So great. I look forward to the conversation Peter and I are going to have. I hope in all of that twisting and turning, one of the things that came out is that what I am still passionate about, probably the most passionate thing I'm about, is seeing like a camera. I mean, even though I do a fair amount of work with this, it's still for me the core joy in photography for me, besides making a living and telling stories like you saw in the film, is simply being in front of something and saying, wow, that's beautiful, or that's interesting, or that's fascinating. Let me see if I can get it here, or whatever I'm using for technology at the time, and share it with other people. That's my particular thing. My wife is a fine art photographer. Some who are in the audience may know her work. And her strategy is completely different. And she can't do what I do, and I can't do what she does. But I think one of our successes is that we both found our respective niches. And I think why don't we start talking, Peter? I'll be happy to try to answer either your questions or maybe some audience questions if they pop into the chat along the way. And then we can come back. In terms of the actual class, it is 3 days, it is in person. It's really built heavily around a combination of some lessons that I've distilled over the years and turned into lessons that I've presented to many different workshops, Maine, ICP. I've taught in LA, at LACP, in Hollywood, and when they were out in Venice before. So it's a combination of those lessons that I've developed to help people better see. And then there's a whole series of lessons on also the really important art of editing. And let me be clear, when I say editing, it's that selecting of making many, many photographs and picking the best 2 or 3. That's how, as an old publication photographer, that's what we meant by editing. I don't mean post-production or changing them as much as finding the best ones in camera, because that's my particular strategy. And that's what works for me, doesn't always work for other people. So Peter,
Great.
help me here before I back into a corner.
Okay, thank you, David. That was fantastic. And I just got to say, you stressed light and shadow, but your composition is phenomenal. I just love it. Thank you. So I wanted to kind of, I don't want this to be too observational. I'm going to turn it into a question, but and you kind of talked about it a little bit at the end there. Editing for me is always storytelling. And you kind of mentioned, working with print, and storytelling in print, when you worked with a great editor, really was a thing of beauty, the way they could tell the story in terms of layout and taking you through the story. When that's migrated to the web, as you just mentioned, it became kind of a very linear thing. It's like scroll down, scroll down, scroll down, scroll down. And I just wondered, and this kind of popped into my head, and you kind of answered it, is did your interest in film and video come about because you were kind of frustrated with that kind of linear process that story had taken with stills, and the multi-dimensionality, if I'm saying that right, of film kind of maybe appealed to your creative senses?
I know this is supposed to be a conversation, but the answer is easy. Yes, 110% actually, and I never thought about it that way, but yes. I would elaborate just a little bit in that I did work with some extraordinary editors, who went on to National Geographic, almost cliches of New York Times, who are great editors, and editing is a skill that is oftentimes underappreciated or flat out lost. And yes, I did migrate to filmmaking partly to control that. That's also true. And then you throw the addition of sound. And the thing actually that I'm really doing, especially dead of winter, I just look out the window because it's still technically beginning of spring, but end of winter here. I spend my winters editing. I spend my summers shooting films and my winters editing. And I'm not the only one who does that here. But I've really learned to love editing in the last couple of years. And I think it's because of what you said, is that I'm able to control the narrative and how the story unfolds, movement, sound, etc. I think, and I may be going on too long, but you could jump in your time. I think what makes me relatively good at filmmaking is because I spent so long in the world of publication, I'm quite used to getting beaten up with feedback. And I think a lot of photographers don't necessarily take feedback well. And I think that's a real shortcoming. because you need other people to say, maybe that doesn't work so well. And I send my films off to people all the time, and I try to get really, specific, brutal feedback. I oftentimes have to kill your babies, is the expression some film editor once said about when you can't keep in that thing that you love, but won't work. So yes, your question, simply put, is 100% correct, and I hadn't thought about it quite that way till right now, which is why you're doing such a good job of leading the conversation.
That's great. Well, it struck me. Thank you.
Please.
Your methodology really impressed me, kind of the trial and error, especially when you talked about, I don't want to say mimicking, but kind of experimenting with other photographers' style. That's a challenge, I must say, especially for a young student of photography to kind of take that on. Who was the hardest to maybe kind of translate, and which photographer, maybe it's kind of a two-part, where you like, I'm never going to do that? You mentioned sports. I thought that was kind of funny, but was there any photography you're like, I'm never, ever, ever going to do this? Not because you don't like their work, but it just didn't appeal to you, or maybe kind of organic processy.
Kind of like I said, it's a great question again. You're 2 for 2. That wasn't meant to be snide. If it came out snide, I apologize. It's a really good question. The first part is easy in the sense that probably because I was studying history photography, and because it was in California, and because kind of the time period, the Margaret Bork White, Harry Callahan, you can run through Imogen Cunningham, you can run through a litany of photographers who started with something in front of the camera and made some kind of interpretation or reaction or response to it. Okay. And so I was imitating them, and then I would get to people like Dwayne Michaels, where I'm kind of pushing myself because I'm not that. If you've ever seen any of this stuff, he has a very different brain than I do. And I was pushing, but I could experiment with him. I don't think I was as good as he was, but at least I could experiment. Then you turn to like, I don't know, Heineken and some of the people who were doing stuff that's really has very little to do with what's in front of the camera and everything to do about the thought processes of the author. That was a line I could never get past. And I'm not picking on him per se, but a lot of the postmodernist stuff, it's just, I can't do it. And I sometimes I understand it, sometimes I don't, but it's just not what I'm capable of. And I'm, like I said, the one thing I'm really good at is cutting my losses and moving on. And so I learned that pretty fast. Yeah. I also studied with a guy named Leland Rice, who was a photo historian who taught out in Claremont and lives up in the Bay Area. And again, Leland was smart enough to say, look at all this stuff, let's talk about it. You write some paper, have a good time. I think I was that one really, really advanced student who really, really wanted everything from the teacher versus everybody else in the class who I think was doing it because they had to get through it. I still am flabbergasted by the history of photography. I mean, it's one of those things that we all should spend more time appreciating, that I think I do a reasonably good job of, but it's so important. And I know I got off message there, sorry.
No, that's good. LACP, we had a great library of photography, and I always encourage my students, just go there and look at photography through the ages. You will learn so much and be so inspired. One last question before we kind of go to some of the questions that may be in the chat. I haven't checked yet. I read, and you talked about it a little bit, you talked about learning, and you said it today, you became an expert at shooting transparency film. Many people may not be aware, but like most editorial and even commercial photographers, shooting color shot transparencies. And so you had to nail that exposure, and you had to be really good. And so I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. What did you kind of mean? Maybe you could drill down a little bit into when you said you became an expert at it. Specifically, can you just kind of elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, it's changed so much now, but there was a time window, and somebody who's better versed in technology can say, when the magazines started using color in the magazines in large numbers. And then and this goes back to history photography, they started moving out of the studio. That was the first step, was the publication said, we want to use color and we want to have stuff done initially all over the country. Then they started doing stuff all over the world. And so you had to do color slides, and you had to hit the exposure perfectly on the head of the nail. and you had to do all the other things that I like to think I was doing in the images I showed, in terms of narrative, composition, storytelling, light, and you had to get it perfect. And I'm doing the gesture because it's a typical 35 millimeter slide was about that size. And because because of the learning curve was so high, and I had spent so long first learning how to do black and white, and then I started working for magazines. Basically, the reason I was good at color slides was A, not many people did it, and B, if I had enough money to do it, I could learn to get better and better and work my way up the skill set pyramid to better and better publications. And because of that, I also had a relative amount of autonomy, which I think showed up in some of the stories that I showed. And I think that actually goes back to the film. Your question at the beginning about films is a lot of it is also about autonomy. When I worked with great editors, I was very, very happy. But when I worked with people who were really, really like, this is the only way it can be done, do it my way, don't use your imagination, don't take some creative license, don't experiment, it was frustrating. And so it was a moment in time where the need, as you said, was going up and the number of people who were doing it was relatively few. And so I was able to do that for a good period of time. And people also often ask me, I'm not sure that was my favorite time. I will tell you the one thing I loved about that time is if I got that little slide perfect, it was perfect. That was it. And then the other thing, which I do really miss, is you shot the film and you gave it to somebody else and they processed it. I am actually not a big lover of post-production. I really love the fact that somebody else would do that. I would go look on the light box and just go, wow, that's great. Or you screwed up, you have to do some more. But it was very clear, and it was, I actually am not a big fan of post-production. Though it's ironically, now that I'm editing films, I love editing in Final Cut. And I think it's because of your first question about control, putting my own stories together, controlling the narrative. And so learning Final Cut is another one of those things that I'm learning right now. I'm not a master, but I'm getting better every day.
Great, thank you. Ruth has kind of a related question. Do you still shoot film or have you migrated to digital?
I migrated to digital because the other thing that I did actually after the publication world largely disappeared and after the value of my skill set as a slide photographer was vaporized by digital was I did stock photography for many years. When my daughter was young, she's 29 now, but I was, for a good stretch of her childhood, the primary caregiver. And so I was able to stay home and do a ton of stock. She was the Huggies diaper baby for the first 5 years of her life and all sorts of stuff back in the day. So I migrated to digital a little bit reluctantly, but it certainly worked out. But I still miss that in terms of if I could shoot film, I probably would, but the economics of it now are just not.
Right.
But the flip side of that is that film making, motion picture making now with digital cameras has, what I gave away in slides, I gained back in the ability to do movies because I do movies essentially one or two person crew. So I don't have to take as large a crew as you used to have because the digital technology enables me to work so much simpler. Yeah. So it's a trade-off. You lose and you win.
I just encourage anybody, please put some questions in. Oh, here we just popped it up. Really enjoyed, this is from Evie Monroe. Really enjoyed your film. Was this produced using a camera phone and which did you use? Thank you. Thank you for sharing your process.
Well, two things. If Jason can help me out and put my website, which is just davidhwells.com in the chat, I encourage you all to go there and look at the films. That particular film was not made with a smartphone. I have a number of films on my site that were made with a smartphone. Some recent stuff from Morocco, especially. I did a ton of short films edited with Adobe Rush. And the reason I mention that is because Adobe Rush is also, the editing is on the phone, which for me, if I'm in the field and I want to do a little 3 or 4 minute film, I can shoot for 2 hours, do a little 3 or 4 minute film editing on the phone. I'm sorry, I'm doing the gesture right here, and post it, and I never leave this. So for simple filmmaking, it's really quite striking. That was made with a conventional digital camera. I happen to use Olympus Micro Four Thirds, which is what that was made with. But more and more of my short films and all my social media stuff is done with this, especially the newer camera, because of the 3 lenses, it really opens up a universe of possibilities.
Mark Kaufman.
Marky Kaufman asked, yes.
Yeah, did you bracket to get your perfect slide exposures? How did you get perfect exposures? I think I know the answer, but please.
I use primarily Contax rangefinders, which are like Leicas, and I don't want to go too far into gear, except that a camera solves a problem. And the problem back then was 2 things. One is I couldn't carry a lot of gear and I couldn't look like a real photographer in a lot of places. And the Contax cameras don't look like real cameras, and I didn't carry a lot of stuff. And yes, Mark, your point is exactly correct. They had a very nice auto bracket setting, half under what you thought was correct and half over. So I used to start with a hand meter exposure and then bracket. The downside of that is you really only get 12 pictures on a roll, not 36, because of the bracketing. But that was how I achieved perfect exposures for the clients. And the funny thing is, different clients, some wanted the slightly lighter slide, some wanted slightly darker, some wanted the middle. So that is precisely what I did, yes. Now, of course, with digital.
Yeah, I was going to say it's auto exposure bracketing before digital.
Right, it's exactly what it is.
Yeah, yeah. You know, when I used to do travel photography, I'd sometimes see what I called a canvas. In other words, like light and shadow, color, and this kind of this beautiful display that needed some kind of element to come in. And, you know, I'd wait patiently sometimes for long periods of time. Did you kind of employ a similar kind of process, or was it just kind of purely reactive? In other words, you're just kind of being led, and what was there was there.
I'm going to steal this as a segue to the little bit of promotion for my class.
Yeah, please go into that, actually. Yeah.
One of the things that I have learned, and I talk about this in the class, and we actually do an exercise about this in the class, is what I call choke points. You go to a market somewhere, third world, LA, doesn't matter, an outdoor market, and you think to yourself, oh, that moment only happens once. The moment happens once, but everybody goes to that corner and turns right and turns left. And if you understand that idea of a choke point, suddenly you have this opportunity to photograph that thing many different times, above, below, left, right, experimentation, shallow depth of field, all of that stuff, because choke points are where people always have to go through. And one of the things that I do, and I encourage this both in the class and my own photography, I jokingly say that we bring along a teaching assistant, and this is a joke because it sounds a little difficult, but we put nails in your feet to make sure you stay in one place, because most photographers do 2 pictures and they walk away. I tend to stay in a place a really long time. You blend into the woodwork, people forget about you really quick. They go back to whatever it was that was so interesting. The light continues to evolve, those choke points keep playing out. That's the kind of stuff that I've both learned and I translate right into the class. Because moving too fast is probably problem number 1, and not shooting enough is problem number 2. If I had to say anything for most photographers I work with, because my experience is I'd rather spend 2 seconds, move to the right, move to the left, above, below, shoot all of those, and then select the best one, than spend a minute or 2 cropping and actually trying to fix it afterwards. I don't do much in post. I do it all in capture and selection.
That's great. I love the idea of choke point. That makes so much sense. It's brilliant. Yeah.
And you know of them. That's the funny thing about choke points. As soon as you're walking around, everybody's on here tonight is going to look around tomorrow when they're somewhere and say, oh, that's what he meant by a choke point. Yes.
Right, right.
There are choke points everywhere. Yes.
So,
Hollywood Boulevard is one giant choke point, if you like, where the workshop used to be. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I grew up in New York City, many choke points, so I totally get it. I just never use that terminology. That's great. I think this is the time allotted for you to talk about your upcoming workshop, and then I'm going to come in with 5 questions for you.
Okay. The workshop is, as we've been discussing, a mix of, we do look at work, and I think that looking at work is really important because, joking aside, we are visual learners. We have mental hard drive. And what I discovered also in looking at the history of photography is the more stuff that goes in there, the more that you have in your mental hard drive when you're standing in front of something and trying to figure out how do you put it together. And I can't tell you how many times an old picture by whomever will flash in my head. I don't know, Eleanor Carucci, I'm just thinking of names. Harry Callahan, who I think I might have mentioned before. So there'll be a piece of an image that they made, and I'll say, okay, I'm going to use that from that and that from that and put them together to make my own picture. So that's a big part of the class. Going through exercises like choke points, another. The idea of working the situation, which is to take a lot of pictures, not straight on, but above and below and left and right, and really experimenting to photograph till you get the image you want is so important. And the thing that I gave up when I gave up slides and I, gained with digital is that immediate feedback. Think back to the day when you didn't get that immediate feedback. You had to trust that you had done it right and you had to wait a couple, 3 days. That feedback enables me as a teacher to look over your shoulder and say, did you think about X, or did you think about Y, or what about the rotor growing out of Reagan's head? If I'd shot that digitally, I would have been smart enough after I did that terrible picture to move a little bit. So that's a big part of it, the feedback process. And then the second part of the class, of course, is actually some exercises around editing images. And again, editing is selecting, having the ability to look through a lot of pictures and pick out the best ones. And one of the things, and a class is so good for this, especially an in-person class, if I can flog in-person classes, is that if you're in the class and you're editing and watching us select other people's work, you get it. It's very easy, pretty easy to look at others' work and find the top 10 or 15 pictures. It's hard to do that of your own work. But if you do that enough of other people's work, you will start to have that same discipline to bring to your own work. And that's a big component of the class. And then the biggest component of the class probably is that all of these are lessons that you take and like the choke point idea, you use them going forward. If you internalize that idea of working the situation or editing the correct pictures in a 3-day class, you will literally never be the same photographer again. And the other thing you'll probably join is I get a lot of students who write me emails saying essentially, I still hear you in my head when I'm photographing. And I think they mean it as a compliment. I think they mean that they hear me pushing them to do some of these things. But if you go through this process, it changes your photography. And you'll notice that I'm not talking about a single type of photography, whether it's street photography or portraits or landscapes or personal work or commercial work. It's all about having an idea of what you think you want to capture and successfully capturing it and then selecting the best ones. And I mention that because the class is not journalistic specific. I obviously have a journalism background and I made my living doing journalism, but I hope you saw through the film now, I'm doing sort of more interpretive and experiential stuff. And the class is not specific to journalism only. It's really any kind of capture about seeing something that you want to translate to share with other people.
Great,
I hope
thank
that
you.
helps.
Yeah.
More questions, or do I have to suffer the five?
You're going to
questions?
5 questions, but then we're going to go to a Q&A. And if anybody has any questions about the workshop, you'd like to know more, please put it in the chat. So here we go. These are what we ask everybody. What's your favorite book or movie?
Oh boy. I really like Big Fish. Somebody help me out with the director. He does a bunch of sort of pseudo magic realism stuff. Anyway, Big Fish is one. Favorite book? Oh, I don't know. I have tons of favorite books. I just happen, and this may come across as politically incorrect, but I just reread Holidays in Hell, only because P.J. O'Rourke just passed away. And having worked in much of the developing world, especially doing conflict stuff for a while, it is not a very politically correct book, but it is a very funny book. And that's one I just happened to reread only because he passed recently. And I said, I remember the book being really good, and it was really harsh but funny and enjoyable in a weird sort of a way. I could spend a lot of time. Good question, but no easy answer. One day I survived.
Yeah, he's a great writer, very self-effacing, which does make it a little.
Tim Burton, thank you so much, Jason. Yeah, Big Fish, Tim Burton. Thank you.
What's your favorite drink?
I don't drink alcohol, so I definitely am a coffee drinker of biblical proportion. And if you join me for the club, notice that pretty quickly. So certainly a coffee, slight preference for mochas if it matters, but I don't drink alcohol per se.
Probably should be what's your favorite beverage, but that's
Okay, right.
what part of the world would you love to visit that you haven't already?
Oh, that I haven't. Ah, that's different. I thought you were going to say it's my favorite. People ask me that all the time, but I haven't. Oh, I really am looking forward to going to Ukraine in 5 years. And I think you can understand why. And
Yeah.
oh, that I haven't gone. I am doing a film right now, actually, it's just about finished, on a Gambian refugee who's a very big activist here in Rhode Island. And I really would love to go to the Gambia because he has, both because stuff he's shown me from there and his story and his family give me a very different sense. I mean, Africa is this terribly stereotyped, badly mistreated, and I'm not even going to begin to do this correctly, continent. And talking to Omar, I just get a sense of that would be really interesting. And I know with his family there, I would have a good time. And one of the great things about going to India is that because I have so much family there, I'm never seeing it as an outsider. I'm seeing it as a insider, family member, et cetera. And I think I would get to experience Gambia, something like that with Omar.
Great. Two more. What profession other than photography would you have enjoyed?
This is another one of those people who make such stereotypes. I would love to have been an economist. Wow. Because economics at its core is not about numbers, it's about the science of decision making. And I think that the way that we as a society make decisions right now is particularly broken. And I'm not sure they're any better at it, but I do think that some of the Malcolm Gladwell and other people who write economics in a way about contemporary decision making are really getting at least people like me to think about decision making much more broadly and much more in depth, and not about money and not about numbers, but about decision making. I don't think I had the discipline of the brain, by the way, but economics fascinates me.
Interesting. Very, I like the way you kind of explained that too. Tell us something about you that we wouldn't possibly know. A lot of things.
Call my wife in here. Oh boy. No, you would know that. You wouldn't know. Ooh. Everybody who knows me well knows this. My daughter is a dresser on Broadway. And so every time I get to see a play, I get a very different experience of it. Actually, because of COVID, I haven't the last couple shows. But for years, I would go to her shows. And of course, I get to see the play. But then afterwards, I get perfect strangers telling me how wonderful my daughter is. So I don't know if that's something people don't know. But for me, it's pretty special. And that she's found what she loves is very special. So I think I chickened out on that one, but
it's okay.
That's something. So.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Couple of more questions here. And before we wrap, if you have anything, please get in the chat. Marcy Joran, I especially love your trap fishing film. Can you discuss a bit of how that was created, both technically and editorially?
Sure, it's on the website, and if you want to see it, it's one of the films that I'm most proud of. It's done very well in film festivals, one of Film Festival Short Awards. It's about a 7-minute film on a particular type of fishing, which is unique to Rhode Island, where they set out a large trap and the fish swim into the net and they're captured. But the real core of it is this, Corey's 40-something-year-old woman named Corey Wheeler Forrest, who is a fisherman, but also sells her family's fish and tells great stories and touches on everything from the grind to the magic, to the weather, to the family, to the sexism that she encounters. And it started as a short film for a food magazine here in Rhode Island. But as soon as I met her, the first shoot, I said, no, this is much too good. And all of the skills that I developed as a photojournalist enabled me to do that in 3 relatively short shoots. 1 shoot on the dock, 1 shoot out in the water, and 1 shoot going from the water back onto the dock, and that's it. So capture time was technically maybe 8 or 10 hours total over 3 days, spread out over a few months. And why that's so important, because as a photojournalist, you get really good at figuring out that situation will likely yield good footage or stills. Or that situation is going to be a terrible thing, and only going to those times so you can use your time most economically. And then I edited it myself because I like editing. And the magazine was very happy. They didn't pay a whole lot for it because they tend to want to have like a 2 or 3 minute film. They'll basically pay you for 1 or 2 days work, but it was 3 very long days spread out, then 3 days of editing.
Okay. Ruth, I'd love to take a class with you, but sadly can't get to LA. Do you still offer online courses?
I do. They're actually on my site, but you should come to LA. The weather, and depending on where you are, seriously. Yes, I do, and they're on my site, which is there's a page called classes right on my site. So I would send you there, please. Somebody had something, yeah.
Marky Kaufman, do you think filmmakers should study still photography first? Interesting question.
Oh, absolutely, 100%. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think I am. Stanley Kubrick was a magazine photographer before he was a filmmaker. There are a number of them. And I work in the documentary realm, and actually documentary photographers, I think, tend to be the worst because they're really obsessed about the story, which is good and important. But feature film cinematographers really know how to put together a frame, either by having studied photography or looking at great filmmakers. I think one of the things that's most admirable about the film is in motion pictures, people are much more sensitive in a good way to their history. Filmmakers talk about great filmmakers all the time, quite routinely, about who's done stuff before. And filmmakers, young filmmakers, kind of are required to know that stuff. So I did go a little bit around, but I do think actually, yes, filmmakers really should master that frame. And I think that's one of the reasons that I've done well. I've had to learn sound and time, motion editing, but I didn't have to learn how to compose a frame.
Let's thank David, please, everybody. That was fantastic. I learned so much. I really enjoyed it. Wonderful evening, and I really appreciate, we all appreciate you coming out. And literally, you'll be coming out, so that'll be good too.
Looking forward to that. Peter, thank you very much to you. Before, Brandon, if I may just jump in here for a second, thank you because they were great questions, as I think I indicated, and they got me thinking, and now I'm going to be stewing them over tonight as well. So thank you for posing some real questions. And then, yes, Brandon, and thank you to everybody at LACP